All right. Welcome, everyone. Seems like people are still filtering in here. Just give them a couple minutes to come in and get settled. Yeah, great. So just as a reminder to everyone, hey, hello, everyone. I'm Tim Sherwood. I'll be hosting today. Just as normal, we'll have our wonderful presenter here give the her prepared remarks, and then we'll that'll all be recorded, and then we'll shop the recording, and then people free to ask their questions in chat, and we'll promote you into ask your questions with your camera on or with voice if that's what you prefer. So with that, I just want to say we're so excited today to have Linda Akli here presenting for us. I had the pleasure of meeting when you came to visit CBSR a couple years ago, and back when we were still in person, and shared all kinds of amazing supercomputing resources, and worked with many students there, presented a whole seminar. It was absolutely wonderful. So I'm really excited today to have our guest speak. So please take it away.
All right, great. I'm going to share my screen. And so let's see. I want to actually.
Let me just correct myself. I should have said that we should make sure to put your questions for participants. Please put your questions in the Q&A, not in the chat. Thank you.
Okay, so I do actually see a little bit there. So thank you so much. I'm going to put this in presentation mode and see what happens. There we go. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really glad to be here and be able to speak with you this evening. As you may or may not know, I am on the East Coast in the DC area. So it's about 9 p.m. our time. And I will provide a copy of the slides that can be distributed at the end of the talk, because there are some hot links, live links in my slides that you may find useful. So my name is Linda Akli. I'm the Director of IT Initiatives at SURA, the Southeastern Universities Research Association, which is a 60+ academic institution member organization that was founded to manage a Department of Energy national lab that specializes in experimental nuclear physics, which is not my area. And we also support a wide range of collaborative research in the Southeast region. So I'm actually going to start to tell you something about myself, just to kind of level set. I'm from East Orange, New Jersey. East Orange is actually, when I grew up there, it was called the other chocolate city, which DC was the original chocolate city. I currently live in Silver Spring, Maryland, just outside of DC. I earned a bachelor's degree in computer science from Rensselaer, but I did not take a straight line path through that process. I actually went there to study architecture. And after a year in architecture, I switched to computer science by flipping through the catalog, tossing it up in the air, and it landed on computer science. And I ended up leaving with a degree in a bachelor's in computer science and 2 minors, one in what was called at the time Afro-American Studies, which is of course now African-American Studies, and I have a minor in business. I've spent time in industry positions. I've been an entrepreneur. I like to call myself a technologist, and my specialty actually is diversity, equity, and inclusion and workforce development in this engineering and computer science field. And as a person, I'm very much about community, family. I love art. I listen to jazz. I read like a crazy maniac, and I love to travel and see the world. So with all of that said, that might give you a background. I'll give you an idea of why I have so much fun in the work that I do. So before I really get into what what is Exceed, how is it used, and what are some of the sample projects. I first wanted to go ahead and clarify, because terms are used all over the place, and a lot of acronyms are used, but what is actually advanced computing? It's really resources and services that really support your research that are too expensive, too large, too complex for an individual, a small organization, and in many cases, even institutions to actually own and operate themselves. And so that's where you get the national reserve, the national pool, the things that the National Science Foundation and other agencies provide so that the research community can get their work done. But they're provided so that in that way, so that they actually allow for many different users, many researchers to be able to have access to something that would be too expensive. A really good example besides the computing side is if you see this one little item called scientific instruments, think of it like a telescope. Even countries get together to build telescopes. So it is big facilities, large scale facilities, things that you just wouldn't be able to do on your own. And so some of the things that fall under that big title of advanced computing is cloud computing, data intensive computing, parallel computing. You may have heard many of these terms, high performance computing, supercomputing, and all of those things. Really what you're doing is data analytics, data mining, some type of data science, data visualization, modeling and simulation. But all of them, all those things are really things to help you find insights and to learn and have breakthroughs and do research. And the scale is important because when you think about scientific instruments in all of the things that may be used to do research, you can think about sensors, instruments, and particularly now that everything is instrumented. Normally at this point, I would ask you to name where are there sensors and instruments in your own environment. And you can think of things like your car is instrumented in sending data to everywhere. Your fitness tracker is sending data. You may play a sport that has instrumented like a tennis racket. City streets are instrumented because they have sensors out there listening for gunshots. So, I mean, there's just a plethora of places where instruments are collecting data, not just on your computer. And as you know, there's smart homes, so there's all sorts of data happening with your refrigerators, TVs, and everything else. So with that, giving you that kind of backdrop of what is this type of computing? What does it mean? And again, you've probably heard many of those terms. They all fit under the same umbrella. So the project that I'm representing is called Exceed, the Extreme Science and Engineering Discovery Environment. And we actually our project with a particular lifespan. We began in 2011, and we are ending August 31st, 2022 basically August 31st of this year. It is a virtual organization or a federated group of organizations led by a group of 4 leaders that are large scale research computing centers or academic supercomputing centers. And let me just check chat. Okay, that was just about someone's network connectivity. Just wanted to make sure it wasn't a question for me. Then you see these smaller groups, smaller organizations, Cornell, Sura, Ohio University, Internet 2. We are there to provide specialized expertise that the larger organizations don't necessarily have. So what have we actually done since we've been operating for about 11 years? So in the first 5 years of our operations, we actually supported $2.21 billion in research. This is all sorts of researchers from mostly academic institutions, primarily in the United States. There are some industry, some agency, and other people that use it. This pie chart just shows you that the National Science Foundation is the primary funder, that you see other agencies, the National Institutes of Health, Department of Energy, Department of Defense, NASA, the US Department of Agriculture. And for those that might be in the humanities or other areas, that's the all others that show up in this other wedge, because National Endowment for the Humanities and organizations like that are grantors. And so there are faculty researchers in those spaces. This second chart is our second 5 years. It's kind of funny. I could have probably added them all together, but this isn't the way it had been reported. Is in the second 5 years, we've even done more work, and we've done about supported $3.68 billion in research. So you can see the scale of the work and the research that's being done. And I'll talk a little bit later in this presentation about the specific types of research that have occurred in the research domains. So just to get a feel not only of the dollar numbers, this is for we do an annual report. And so the last year's report was done in May, and it's not May yet, so I don't have this year's numbers. But again, $3.68 billion in federally funded research was supported. That's over 60,000 researchers annually getting access to resources so that they can complete their work. We've got about over 17,000 active users on a regular basis, actually coming in, doing actual research, as well as taking training courses and doing other activities. What's interesting is of the 9,000 plus researchers that actually had active research projects, of those researchers, 6,100 were actually graduate or undergraduate students. That may also kind of reflect how research is done in academic institutions, where there's the researcher or project team, and the students actually do a lot of the computational and data analytics work portion of those projects. And then just as an idea of what that impact means, there's more than 17,000 publications that have cited the Exceed resources as part of in their citations for their work when they publish. One of the things I didn't say, since I mentioned the word publishing, is the purpose of our support in providing this infrastructure and supporting these research resources to the community is for open science or open research, which means we expect it will be published. There are other resources for people who need to do work that they might go out and get a patent for, or do other things with, are doing defense work that's actually classified. So ours is very much for open science, where the results of the work are going to be shared. So I mentioned that we are ending in August, and this is our blanket statement that we have been in operation for about 11 years. And there is a new set of awards being made by National Science Foundation, and they're called Access. And the reason we'll share the slide deck is I do have the link. So anybody who's currently an Exceed user and wants to know what the transition plan is to get to the new, to get to Access, which will be the new manager of all the resources, can check that link on a regular basis. We're expecting an announcement on that sometime towards the end of this month. And this is something that happens every 10 to 12 years. National Science Foundation just recompetes this work. Dr. Tedegao and I both were researchers with using the predecessor to Exceed, which was called TerraGrid. So it is very possible, and it's always set up in a way to make it easy for researchers to move from the current set of systems and the current management structure to the next one. And I expect a lot of what is going to be offered in the next one will be very similar to what we offer now and how we actually grant access. So I'm gonna flip real quick, and please let me know if you actually can hear this video. But I found this video. I think there's a couple of things that it's always great to find out why it's good to know why is high performance computing or supercomputing important.
Linda, does it have sound?
Yeah, it looks like the sound, as usual, isn't coming through. So I'm gonna actually
You might
stop
need to
this.
connect your sound to when you do the share. Make sure you do optimal for video sharing.
Okay, let me try that. If not, I'll just go ahead and skip that and go back to the presentation. Let me just go to the
Well, you
presentation.
can drop me the line, and I can also share it if you need to with the sound.
Okay, yeah, it's, I have other examples. So let me just move on to from this one. Because yeah, there's always this challenge with the Zoom and the sharing of the information. So that was just, and the link is in the slide. So if you want to go back to it, you certainly can look at it, but it's a general, more general, it's not specific to Exceed. What I'm going to do now is actually talk about some of the research projects supported by Exceed more generally. And then I'm going to move into talking about, I'd like to really share some student work with you, since I understand this is a student group. So, and you'll note that some of my examples I've tried to pick are actually related to California, because one of the things I think is important when you look at how would you use these systems, you want to think about applications and ways and issues and challenges in your own particular community. And I think that helps you really make the connection on how you can use these systems. So in this case, the Southern California Earthquake Consortium ran simulations, looking over a time period of 10 years. Now, some of you may be familiar with the mechanical way that people have done a lot of earthquake simulations, which are called shake tables. But shake tables, mechanical ways, physical ways to test things have their limitations. And so if you can do these models and simulations, you can go beyond what the limitations of the mechanical or the physical ways that you might run experiments. So couple of things that came out of this particular experiment is they looked at how the emergency responders respond in to disaster, and in particular to earthquake. But what I want to do is actually mention the next slide, because I think this is going to tie into what I'll talk about later. Is so when what do you do once you learn this information, when you get to the point of having some insight? You want to change policy. And policy, you want to make change, you want to have impact. So in this case, the results of those simulations and that particular research work, they were able to put together a resilience by design plan, which was basically reflected in public policy in Los Angeles. And it's a plan to how do you strengthen the buildings, how do you fortify the water supply, and how would you enhance your telecommunication systems during those scenarios. And so that's one way you can see, you take your research and then you enact it in policy, or you get funding for changes that you want to make, but it's data driven. You have some basis to be able to propose those changes. Another project, not a science direct project, maybe of interest, particularly to people who are studying history or African American studies or other cultural studies, is this one was done by Dr. Ruben Mendenhall at Illinois. And this was recovering lost history. And she was able to use data mining and go back through a certain time period and look at literature that and examine and look for the voices of African American women, which are rarely actually reflected when people write history books. And the upshot on this was she could not have the number of texts, journals, books, periodicals that she was able to data mine using a supercomputer was greater than what she could have looked at in her entire career. And that just gives you an idea of the power of using the computing power, even if you're not a computer person. She worked with a team, and I have a link to the podcast that gets more details about this, but she had to work with a team. So it was, African-American studies, working with the computer scientists, and they collaborated together because she did not know anything about the computing side of it, but she had to work with a team, and those experts didn't know anything about African American studies, and they had to come together. Even they had language barriers when they spoke and tried to understand the process. And it took about 2 years for this project to really come to fruition. But it's a good example, particularly from a looking at reviewing history and trying to understand different historical perspectives other than what's been put out there more routinely. This is one of our more recent pieces that I think is interesting and probably of concern to, can't imagine anyone who hasn't been touched by our current situation with COVID and the pandemic. And during the pandemic, early on, under the Trump administration, the White House did stand up a high performance computing consortium to support the research so that we could get to some solutions quicker. And one of the things that happened when they did that, they brought together different agencies like Department of Energy, but they also brought private industry in like IBM. And so what they did is they brought all this compute time together and resources, but there was no one except for Exceed who had any experience of how do you actually grant access and choose the projects and figure out how everything will fit onto all the resources that you have available. And so Exceed had a leadership role in that process, and they actually ended up mirroring our processes and systems in order to be able to give all the researchers, COVID researchers, access to this pool. This is now going on to a position of they're working on a plan to create a national compute reserve. And that national compute reserve would be used whether it's COVID or the next pandemic or another crisis situation. It is even possible you could use a national compute reserve to deal with other social issues, social justice issues as well, like during the summer of George Floyd, and looking at policing and systemic racism in US. So that reserve, we'll see where they're still working on that. It's not been completely granted, but the COVID consortium has actually set the blueprint for the potential for a national compute reserve on a broader scale. This is another project, Arecibo. The telescope in Arecibo is one of the oldest radio telescopes. I think it is the oldest radio telescope. It's physically in Puerto Rico, in Arecibo. And it was already being planned to be decommissioned. And they had all this data had been collecting over 50 years. So you can imagine the scale and size and amount of data that was. So they were going to decommission it, and they need to figure out what to do with the data. And so Exceed was able to actually offload and store all of the data from Arecibo, from the observatory. What's really interesting about that is we completed the movement of the data, and right after that, the telescope naturally collapsed even before the official decommission date. I also found this interesting because while we were doing training in Puerto Rico, we did have the opportunity to actually see the telescope, and it was a pretty amazing facility. So we can preserve, so you can think of using these systems for preservation purposes. as well. So what I do want to talk about next is what do we do in the area that I actually manage, which is workforce development and broadening participation. And under that umbrella, we have three main programs that we've been operating. The first one is Advanced Computing for Social Change. The second one is called Hack HPC and HPC in the City. And then the third one is Empower. So the first two, Advanced Computing for Social Change and Hack HPC, those actually happen typically concurrent or around the time of a couple of major conferences about twice a year. They're very short encounters with students. And we've actually had a couple of students from UC Santa Barbara participate in Advanced Computing for Social Change. And we spend about a week or so with them under the normal format when we're in person. We spend longer than a week because it's spread out differently when we do it virtually, as we have done for the last few rounds. But Advanced Computing for Social Change, I'll talk about in depth how that program's structured, what the students have done, and then show you a couple of example projects from that. Hack HPC is one of our newer offerings. That's actually a collaboration with several corporations, including Omnibon and Google. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But even with that one, once we stepped in to be a co-sponsor, we interjected social justice, social challenge projects, as opposed to some of the more typical projects that people like to do in hackathons, like zombie invasions. And then the last one is more of an internship program, which we support. And a lot of times we can get the students from the Hack HPC and the Advanced Computing for Social Change to actually move beyond the very quick. For the Hack HPC is actually really crazy. It's 96 hours over 4 days. And then Advanced Computing for Social Change is like 5 days to be able to go in and do a semester-long project. So one of the things before I jump into those projects, I always like to share with students, why should you, I told you about the cool resources, the scale of the resources, some of the bigger grand challenge projects, but why should you as a student, even if you're not a computer science student, why does advanced computing and data science, why does it matter to you? And one of the things I normally would ask in an in-person, and I'm probably asked this the time I was physically at UC Santa Barbara, was I asked, who in the room gets up every morning and gets excited and jumps up and down, just waiting, the first thing they want to do in the day is write some code? And rarely do I get more than one or two people that raise their hand. And even with a degree in computer science, I wouldn't raise my hand. I want to solve problems. Most people want to solve problems. They want to make a difference in the world. But advanced computing and data science, those skills actually give you a basis and a foundation and a set of skills to enhance your other skills to be able to make those changes. Because data-driven decisions, data helps you make a case and take away sometimes the emotional components that get mixed in when people start to argue about different positions or they're on differing sides. But when you look at the data is not going to lie. Now, some people can interpret it and make it look different. The other side, so even if you don't want to be a data scientist, almost every field that you're going to work in is going to require these sets of skills. So I'm going to talk first, because this is related to the Advanced Computing for Social Change. So I'll start with that student program. But we've really looked at data, using data science as an enabler. And we're excited about Advanced Computing for Social Change because we found that this is not focused on computer science students. This is students from all disciplines. In fact, I know the first student that we had from Santa Barbara was actually an English major, and she was amazing. She did a great job. She's come back, she came back to the program a couple of times as a mentor. And the idea here is to engage students who are not necessarily your traditional computer science students, to get them engaged with data science, to get them engaged with computational resources. And so again, because most people want to be a change maker, not a coder. They don't want to code for coding's sake. So how does this program work? We started it in 2016. We co-located it with a conference or event called Supercomputing, and we engage with undergraduates. And again, most of them are not computer science students. They've been biology, economics, social sciences, humanities, and I'd say English, because I don't want to say humanities is a broad category. And we have the students learn to apply the data analysis, and they actually access the supercomputing computers during their experience to actually work on a social challenge. And they work in groups. They try to construct non-biased questions to explore. They use the computational resources to really create the visualizations and do the data analysis to confirm and debunk their hypothesis. And it is team-based science. So the topics that we have actually covered during these events, the first one, we tie them to what's happening around us. So we've tied the first one actually was 2016, and Black Lives Matters. The movement was really hot then, and so we focused it on Black Lives Matters, and the students really explored different options for looking at inconsistent policing, the issues of not having community policing, what would be policy changes, and they really dug into that data. Now, not all data is not always available. Some jurisdictions have it. As you know, some areas are more transparent than others. So sometimes there are data gaps that we have to deal with. In 2017, we were in Denver. It was right after Trump was elected, and we decided to explore, because the hot topic was immigration, and we did have students look at a lot of different dimensions of immigration, and many of them found data that showed that how immigrants really contribute an incredible amount to the economy. In 2018, we looked at violence, and they were able to pick a number of topics under that umbrella topic. And then we spent a few years on maternal and infant morbidity and mortality. That was right around the time where I think Serena Williams and a number of other people really began to raise the issue of African-American women and the treatment in the health system. And we saw this type of maternal and infant morbidity and mortality based on ethnicity and race. And then in 2020, because we went virtual, students got to pick a lot of different topics. So to just give you an example, from the students that worked on the maternal and infant morbidity and mortality, they actually looked at, does the language that you speak impact your experience when you're giving birth? And the student picked it, and a lot of times the students pick the topic because it's very personal. Something has happened to them or someone in their family or someone they know, and it causes them to want to explore that piece of data. And so this was at Supercomputing 19, the last time we were in person actually, and they were able to present on the show floor and have a big audience. It's kind of a little bit intimidating, but it's also a really great experience. And this was actually lightning talks. I have another video that I'm gonna have to skip, but given I don't want to play with the sound issue and take time away from the Q&A time. Let me stop this. So this one is, we just recently did advanced computing for social change in Hawaii. And they had several topics they could choose from. They were all specific to Hawaii. Well, it was actually South Pacific. We had students from not just Hawaii, but from Guam, from the Marshall Islands. It was very spread out. It was also very challenging given the number of time zones, because we had some in the central time zone as well, and Pacific. So very challenging to do the remote version of that. But the students had the choices to work on things like they did sentiment analysis. And the reason I'm showing this is because it's a little bit different than what I showed you earlier, which a lot of them are very science-based with the exception of Ruby Mendenhall's work. And this shows you that they worked with word clouds and looked at, in this particular case, groups of students looked at, was there a change in sentiment? They did a sentiment analysis towards people traveling or tourism, and they picked the individual months to actually explore, and they were able to mine different sources of data, Twitter feeds, other things, and draw some conclusions about that. So I won't really run the video, so I'll skip to the next one. They also, which I didn't mention on the Hawaii slide, was in addition to that, they also looked at a couple of local environmental issues as well. So with the hackathon, we just did a hackathon that ended last week, 96 hours, and they had a group of teams. And in this case, with the hackathon, because we've given them some social challenge issues to choose, we had one group, the Spell House Tiguars, actually looked at gentrification issue. They were looking at historical data from Instagram and looking at how some of the pictures of certain neighborhoods changed over time. And it was kind of more of a preservation and understanding how to preserve imagery, because a lot of the old community is disappearing, in particular due to gentrification. And how do you capture that so you don't lose the sense and the information about that community? Another one, the Nourishment Ninjas, actually look at food desert issues in certain communities. And then we had another group that did look at, they looked at population health and they compared it by ethnicity and race. So again, we're infusing the social challenges into the HPC, the hackathons as well. In the past, hackathon topics and modeling topics have been like the zombie apocalypse or other made up topics. And so we've decided, we've brought in our advanced computing for social change kind of themes into these other arenas. In this case, this is a student in our Empower. She spent a semester, she's at University of Delaware, and she was able to actually run computations and actually look at do some simulations, use molecular dynamic simulations for HIV and Ebola viruses. And one of the things I want to mention about that, which is kind of interesting, is I actually heard a talk by Dr. Fauci about COVID. And one of the reasons that we were able to get to a COVID vaccine so quickly, well, there were three or four main reasons. The first was they had already stood up this kind of pandemic department or division within the National Institutes of Health. Second was, and in that division, they had already been running models and looking at HIV, Ebola, and other types of viruses that move very quickly. And then third, because of the power of the supercomputers, they were able to run these simulations and analysis so much quicker. And so those are some of the reasons that a lot of us who were hesitant and said, how are we getting to a vaccine so fast? That was part of the answers to how we got there so quickly. This one I put in, and again, there's a YouTube link to this one as well. This is completely different than looking at COVID, looking at climate change, looking at historical data. This is a student who used Jetstream, which is a cloud-based system, and some machine learning techniques to look at frog calls. And they're trying to understand the movement and of the frogs. And with a lot of animals and different species and also insects, there's a climate change issue associated with those as well. As we damage or we lose species, what does that actually do? So in his case, he was tracking and looking at using frog calls and machine learning to actually identify those calls, to kind of look at the movement And are we losing those frogs? Are they moving somewhere? And what's the impact of climate and all of these changes on the native species? So after these students do all these projects, what happens to them? Well, just to give you an example, this student, Maurice, is actually, he came in 2016 where we weren't restricting just to undergraduates. We had graduate students in there as well. But he actually went on, he was an undergraduate who went on to graduate school and he finished his PhD. And now he's actually a postdoc fellow at Brown University. And one of the things is he gained a lot in his own professional development, and he uses these tools and these skills in what he's doing now. What was interesting about Maurice, he was in the group that looked at Black Lives Matters. He kind of broke off from his group, and he actually spent a lot of time looking at data and data sets around the arrest rates. And he was so alarmed by, which we all are, but sometimes these stories get suppressed or don't get as much press, that he was looking at criminalization data in Mississippi and how 12-year-old kids who maybe lifted a backpack were ending up incarcerated and with records. And he did a lot of analysis, and it was clear in his analysis that it was, it was broken down on racial lines. And so that led to some other work that he did later, has been doing later in his career. This student, we brought him in actually into a research experience for undergraduates at Texas. He was at Albany State University, which is a very small school in the southeast corner of Albany. And I met him at the Emerging Researchers National Conference, and he walked up to me and said, "I don't know why I didn't win." And I said, "Well, I didn't judge you. I don't do biology, I do computer science." We started a dialogue. I got him to apply to the REU. He got into that research experience with Texas. Again, it was virtual, which is very tough, but it worked out. And by the time he finished that experience and got those skills, coupled with some of the other training he was doing with us and the work that he was doing, and he applied to graduate school, he got 10 full scholarships to pursue a PhD. That's how much those skills and those experiences really helped him. And there was a lot of work that we did, not just with the science and everything, but also a lot of career work, career guidance, professional development. I actually had him give me a call once a month to give me an update and go through the list of the graduate schools that he was applying to, so we could actually identify people who could help him and he could talk with. But you can see that the students, they do leave their undergraduate programs. They do go on to graduate degrees. We also have a number that are out in the workforce: Google, Indeed, Lockheed. And then we do have some that have gone into the nonprofit sector. So we're proud of our students. I think those are interesting, exciting projects. This is my typical end of my slide deck. You can see more science stories at this link on Science Stories about the different kinds of projects people do. I have a link there if you want to actually see the videos from the hackathon projects where the students looked at gentrification and food deserts. And then that's our general website, and that's how you get in touch with me. With that, I'm really excited to do the Q&A part now. So did I hit my mark at 45 minutes okay, Tim and Sharon?
Did great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Wonderful. And that's great. So we'll end up the recording part of the session. Thank you, everyone, and begin some